Welcome back to our Route 66 overview as we're looking at the 39 books of the Old Testament that we have already gone through, and we're kind of reviewing this week. And like yesterday, we went from Genesis through Ruth. Today we'll pick it up at 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel is a book about kingdom. The people of Israel had pretty much rejected the Lord by the time of the judges. They didn't have much going with God, just a handful of people like those in the book of Ruth. But for the most part, people were not walking with God. The Lord raises up a final judge by the name of Samuel, and Samuel would be a final judge and also a major prophet. He was a godly man, and he led the people of Israel in the right direction. But there came a day in which the people wanted a king, and so they call upon Samuel to give them a king. God wasn't pleased with that, but he did give them one, a man by the name of Saul, who had all the outward appearances of being a great king, but he turned out to be a pretty big failure. So our key word is kingdom. Our key verse is in 15:22. 2 Samuel is the second part of this. And in the original 1 and 2 Samuel were only one book, but it's broken down into two books in our English Bibles. And the key word there is David. Saul had failed in setting up a kingdom that would be honoring to God, but David would not. David would be a man after God's own heart, and that's why 22:2 is our key verse. This book is all wrapped around David in one way or the other, as it gives the history of Israel and David's life. Then we move into 1 Kings after David passes away. In the very first words almost of 1 Kings, his son replaces him and begins to continue that dynasty that the Lord had set up for David. But unfortunately, we find that Solomon did not continue to walk with the Lord for very long. After many years, it was several years, but he married a lot of women. Those women led him astray. And so our key word for 1 Kings is compromise. Because he compromised with the things of the Lord. Now, David was never a perfect man. He failed in some miserable ways, but he always had a heart for God. Solomon lost that heart and began to worship other deities, other idols, and he compromised. And that set the agenda for the years to come. When we come into 2 Kings, we find that the kingdom has now been divided between Israel and Judah. Rehoboam is Solomon's son, and he keeps the southern tribes. But Jeroboam has led a rebellion, a civil war, and he's in charge of Israel now. And so we come to 2 Kings, and what we find is a rebellion on our hands, and not only a rebellion between kingdoms, but a rebellion of the people. Over and over and over, the people rebel against the Lord. And so 17:15 becomes our key verse there. If I didn't mention in 1 Kings, it was 18:21. 1 Chronicles and 2 Chronicles covers much of the same material. In 1 Chronicles, we have as our key word covenant, because it talks so much about God's covenant with David and his dynasty. And God has made a promise to David that there'd be an ongoing dynasty, that eventually one would sit on his throne that we know later on is Jesus himself on the throne of David. So we have this covenant, and 17:16 is our key verse. But the 2 Chronicles, we find the people slipping more and more into sinful behavior. And yet the Lord told them that if they would seek his face and humble themselves, that he would heal them and he would forgive them. That's our key verse as well, 7:14. And our key word is to seek. One major difference between the Chronicles and the Kings is the Chronicles are almost exclusively about Judah. The southern tribes and David's descendants and so forth, were the Kings was about both tribes. That moves us into Ezra. Ezra is the history of Israel as they come back from exile. The people have now gone into exile as a result of rebellion against the Lord. Ezra will bring them back. And our key phrase in that book is the hand of the Lord, because Ezra had God's hand on him. And he became a very mighty, useful tool in God's hand, chapter 7 and verse 10. And then Nehemiah. Nehemiah would be a friend of Ezra. Together they would restore the walls of Jerusalem and also the hearts of the people to God. Nehemiah was a governor, and he was a great leader, and between him and Ezra, they brought about a great revival in the land. Chapter 8, verse 8 is our key verse. And then finally, Esther. Esther tells about what's going on among the Jews who didn't come back to Jerusalem after the exile, but they're still in Persia. And this is a story about the sovereignty of God. That's our key word, sovereignty. And our key word is actually Jew. And the reason why is because the word Jew is found over 40 times in this book, where it's found only twice before. And so the idea and the identity of the Jew is coming into play here. And we find chapter 4, verse 14 is the key word. We'll stop there and pick up the wisdom literature tomorrow. I hope you have a wonderful day in the Lord.